One of the first things that most of us think about in a color grade is balance, meaning the relationship between the red and green and blue in our image. And because balance deals with all three of these colors, balance is effectively a three-dimensional problem or a three-dimensional space that we have to navigate. Navigating that space can be overwhelming. It can be disorienting. It can be really difficult to figure out what's needed and how exactly to get there. So in the next 3 videos in this series, we are going to talk about strategies for how we can build better balance. Today, I want to show you my fundamental go-to techniques for balance, but before I do, we need to zoom out just a little bit and talk about concepts, because oftentimes when we're balancing or doing anything else in color grading, we can get hung up on the idea that we just haven't found the right twist of the right knob to get the result that we want, when oftentimes it is our concept that is at fault that's holding us back. So I want to make sure we have the right concepts before we dive in. So let's ask the simplest question that we can about balance. What's the point? What's the goal? Why do it at all? Now, if you're like I was early in my career, you might have some canned answers in mind. You say that balance is about correcting, for example. You might want to say that it's about fixing the image and getting it into a neutral state. Or you might even have some narrower, more specific rules and say, well, my image is balanced when I have neutral highlights or when I have neutral shadows. That's what it means to balance the image. I want to reframe that a little bit today. Balance for a creative colorist working in a contemporary color grading context is not about correcting the footage. It's not about fixing things. It's not about neutralizing things. It's about elevating. It's about enhancing. Okay? So we are not here to correct. We are here to compel. We are here to elevate. If we can take that mindset into our balancing, we're going to have much better luck right out of the gate, because instead of trying to get the right answer on the test or discipline the material into what it needs to be, we're going to be more focused on getting the most preferential reproduction that we can. Now, there's some basic parameters in place that our taste is going to guide us on. Generally, we're not going to turn skin lime green, for example. Generally, we're not going to turn skies pure purple, for example. But within those boundaries, within those basic confines of taste, it's a very large playing field, and the goal is not to get the right answer, it's to get a compelling answer for the material that we're working with. So let's take that idea into everything that we talk about today. Let's take a look here inside of Resolve and talk about how that plays out practically. Now, a couple notes very quickly before we dive in that I should share before we start looking at balance. First of all, I have set up color management for this project. So even though I've done no shot level grading yet, I have a color management pipeline that's in place that's supporting my image, that's taking me from what the camera saw, meaning this right here, or rather, let me bypass my color management and show that to you. This would be the unmanaged image. And then if I turn that back on, you can see it enabled. And this is all about taking us from what the camera saw to what the display can show. Now, if you're not familiar with color management, you want to learn more about it, I talk about it all the time here on the channel. Start with my DaVinci Wide Gamut Workflow series, where I will show you exactly how to build the color management that I'm using here in this project today. Another thing that I talk about in that series that I'm doing here today is I have a macro or a global level look in place already before I begin grading. That's very important to do. So if we go over here to the timeline section of my node graph, you can see that I have 2 of my core elements LUTs here in place. And as I flip those off and on, not only on this image, but on, say, that image or this image, I'm getting a more preferential result. I'm getting things that are moving me closer in the creative direction that I might like to take this material. And I emphasize this because you might look at my initial image and say, well, Cullen, that's kind of cheating. Doesn't that already look pretty darn good? Aren't you kind of taking it easy on yourself in a video that's supposed to be about balance? And I'd say, yeah, maybe you're right, because the footage that I'm working with today does indeed look pretty darn good. But I would also emphasize that the reason this footage looks good before I've even begun balancing is because that's my explicit goal. I will go out of my way to ensure that I have color management and a look in place that accomplish that for me, regardless of the material that I'm working with, because I know if I have a better foundation, my balance is going to look that much better when I start to apply it on top of that. So that should be our expectation. That really goes back to something I talk about in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. First of all, that macro beats micro. And the other thing that we're going to get into right now is the other core concept that really applies here, which is that broad beats narrow. Okay, so let's talk about that right now. And for now, I'm going to skip over where I might normally start here in my template node graph. So this is just a template graph where nothing's actually been done yet. I'm going to skip over exposure and ratio, which would be my normal starting points, and say that I'm pretty happy with those things. And let's go over to balance. Let's talk about strategies for balancing this image. Now, the first thing that I want you to think about or try when you are balancing your image and you're in a proper color managed environment and you've got a look in place, all those things that we just talked about, is to use your offset. Why? Because offset is the broadest possible tool that we can apply to the task of balance. It's literally moving the entire image in one direction or the other. And we can see that if we look at our scopes here. I'm going to move these over to this area. You can see that as I start to move my offset ball, or if you didn't have a control surface like I do, you could move this little bullseye here in the middle of the offset wheel. You can see as I'm moving this, I'm literally just moving the entire signal mass in whatever direction I pull my trackball, right? So it's the simplest possible operation. It's oftentimes all that you need when you are balancing. A fun historical fact, color timers, the predecessors of modern day colorists, only had offset at their disposal. It was the only means they had of balancing their image. They had no other tools, and they made the images look pretty darn good in a lot of my favorite movies. So don't snooze on the offset. It's the foundation. It's the go-to. You should be maxing this out before you consider doing anything else, okay? So let's say in this image that my goal is to kind of warm things up and get a little bit more sunsetty. So I'm just going to kind of feel my way toward that type of adjustment. I've got one eye on the image, one eye on the vector scope, and I'm just looking for kind of a more golden orangey reproduction. You can see when I flip this off and on, I'm starting to get in that direction. Now, let's do an experiment. I'm going to grab a still of this. Let's wipe out one of my old stills here and grab that still. I'm going to turn this gallery off so you can see my image nice and large. Maybe I'll even expand this out a little bit more for us. And let's talk about a different approach to balance that we might take. Maybe instead of our offset, we want to try using our gain, right? What's the difference going to be there? What am I going to see when I use gain versus my offset? Well, with gain, we are going to have more effect on the top end of our image and less effect as we are moving down the tone scale toward our shadows and toward our pure black. So that by the time we actually get down to pure black, we're having no effect whatsoever. And when I say pure black, I mean an actual zero value in our image. So let's take a look at how that compares and say, I'm going to do my warming with my gain instead of with my offset. Same goal. I'm just trying to kind of move things up into that northwest quadrant and get more of a sunset feel here. And I'm just doing this by eye. I'm not being particularly precious about it, but I'm just saying I'm going for roughly the same goal I was going for a moment ago with my offset. I'm just going to try to accomplish it with my gain. And this is one of these things that when you look at this right now and we have no frame of reference, no comparison, what would you say? Is this wildly different or fairly similar to what we just did with offset? In my mind's eye, it might feel pretty close, right? But this is why I like to grab stills and compare stills and stage what I like to call like a shootout. It's oftentimes difficult to know which one is better without trying both, okay? So if we wipe between one and the other, and let's actually go ahead and move this wipe slider all the way over, you can see the results are actually fairly similar, okay? But in this image, if you look at the concrete down here in the lower left-hand corner, in the version where we were using offset, that concrete has been more warmed, versus here in the version where we're using gain, our shadows, our lower values are being less affected by the operation because that's the nature of a gain operation, okay? So that's another tool in your toolkit if you're wanting to create warmth or maybe cool things off in your highlights but have less impact in your shadows, then gain might be a good thing to look at. But again, I would start with offset and only contemplate gain or some of the other tools that we're going to talk about if offset is not getting the job done for you. Now, let's look at another scenario. I'm going to reset this gain adjustment. Let's actually save it just for fun. I'm going to reset it. We could also look at using our lift, which is going to have the opposite effect of our gain, right? It's going to affect things more in the bottom, and the influence as you start to climb up toward a value of 1 toward your highlights is going to get less and less as you move further and further up. Now, it's worth noting lift doesn't really have the response visually that you might expect when you are working in a color managed environment. Lift has a very broad influence, and it's going to influence much more of the image than you might expect. You might expect it to be more sort of confined or localized to lower tonal values like the pavement here in the lower left-hand corner of the frame. That's what you might expect, but you can see I'm actually getting a fairly broad adjustment here. So while lift is a perfectly valid and nice broad tool to use, I would encourage you in most cases to skip past it, and I would say you really don't necessarily need it, and I would instead look at maybe using offset instead, okay? And then the one more that I want us to look at here together would be our gamma. Now again, if we look at gamma in terms of what it's actually doing, it is going to move things in whatever direction we push it in between 0 and 1, meaning pure black and pure white, but pure black and pure white themselves are going to remain pinned. So let's start going with our warming adjustment here. Now, I'm going to go over to the gallery, and I'm just curious now to compare back to that original still we saved from when we were doing our warming with offset. And again, if I just kind of like eyeball things here and look at my results, let's move this wipe all the way over here and take a look at the results. Again, they're kind of more similar than you would think, aren't they? So what's the biggest takeaway that we can take away from lift, gamma, gain, and offset as our balancing adjustments? Well, it's helpful to understand what each of these things does and how they relate to each other. But it's also really helpful to do an exercise like this, and you can do it as many times as you want, and observe that lift, gamma, and gain are not that different from what you're getting with your offset. And oftentimes, in my experience, they can end up being a distraction. And we can go, oh, maybe I need to do a little bit of offset, and now a little bit of gamma, and now a little bit of lift, when in fact, we're just overcomplicating something that could probably be accomplished exclusively or almost exclusively with our offset. So regardless of whether you stick solely with offset, here would be my prescription for you for sort of fundamental balancing of the nature that we are talking about today. Start with offset for sure. Max out that offset. Push it as far as you can before you even think about using anything else. And then I'm going to give you an exercise that I'll challenge you with for the next time you are grading something. Pick one of these other tools, just one. You really don't need more than one in my experience. For me, it's typically gain. There are definitely situations, especially situations where we might have a deeper shadow range than we have in this image. Like let's go over here to this shot and let's do a quick comparison here of doing, say, I'm going to reset this node here real fast, like so. And let's do our offset on this image. Just same kind of thing, just warming for the sake of demonstration. A fun thing to look at here as well is I'm kind of trying to ride my skin tone line, which you can see over there in my vector scope. Let me try to move this so you can see my primaries as well. Trying to ride that skin tone line. I really don't want to end up over here. I'd rather err on this side if anything. So I'm just kind of trying to warm along that axis. And so this is warming this image with offset. Let's grab a still and then let's reset that and try doing the same thing with our gain. And you can see probably more prominently here than in that prior frame, when I compare the two, my shadows in the first version have gotten warmer, whereas here in this second version, I'm maintaining some of those nice cool shadows. So in that sense, you can almost create more color contrast if that's your goal, if that's your intent. But regardless, start with that offset and then pick one of these other tools and see how far you can get with just those. Because as I said, oftentimes we can end up overcomplicating things and feeling like we have a really complex problem to solve because we have to find the perfect ratio of offset, lift, gamma, and gain to apply to the image, when oftentimes we just need a really sound, really solid offset adjustment and perhaps a little bit of a tune or a tweak with a more narrow tool like we get with our lift, gamma, or our gain. And that's really the point I would leave us with today for this conversation, is to go back to that colorist 10 commandments principle that broad beats narrow. Offset is the broadest possible adjustment, and even though something like gain or lift or gamma are still fairly broad, they are narrower than your offset, so you want to max out that offset before you go sort of the next click up the ladder to something slightly more narrow, and then nuance things with that narrower tool only where needed. So we've just taken an initial foray into a very big subject, something that governs every single grade that we tackle as professionals, or even if we're only grading our own material. It's one of the core considerations of a color grade, right? The overall balance of the image. There's so much to talk about here. We're going to go so much deeper on this subject in the next couple installments in this series, but we've got a great foundation laid here, and we're going to talk about this foundation in more depth in my Friday live stream that we do called Grade School, where we're going to hang out together for an hour, and you can ask anything that you want to about what we've discussed today. We can look at different scenarios. We can talk about different challenges, different techniques that can net the best results. We're going to chop this up and go into much more detail than we have today. So I hope to see you in there if you do want to go deeper on this subject. And if not, definitely check out part 2 when that one drops next week. And we're going to continue exploring just what it means to evaluate and then to move toward the proper or the desired balance for our image.